Peggy Guggenheim, born Marguerite Guggenheim on August 26, 1898, emerged as one of the most pivotal yet paradoxical figures in 20th century art. Her life contained a swirl of unbridled wealth and wrenching tragedy, scorching love affairs and searing heartbreak, rebellious tastes, and a restless yearning for purpose. Over decades, she fashioned a mythic persona that merged muse, maverick, and collector, a complex woman whose audacious personal choices were mirrored by her groundbreaking art acquisitions. Although she enjoyed the glimmer of opulence from birth, she also wrestled with a deep sense of insecurity and isolation. To truly understand Peggy's path, we must trace the interplay of personal trauma, bohemian passion, and visionary dedication that brought her from the opulent edges of high society to the absolute core of modern art. She was born into two dynasties: the Guggenheims, a mining and metals empire, and the Seligmans, a prominent banking family. The Guggenheims amassed vast fortunes in copper, silver, and lead, reshaping American industry. Peggy's father, Benjamin Ben Guggenheim, stood among the flamboyant heirs of that immense fortune. Her mother, Florette Seligman, descended from a line of bankers who had introduced new philanthropic and cultural traditions to New York. From the outset, Peggy's life was drowned in opulence. She arrived in the world at a grand New York hotel, then was raised in a grand mansion overlooking Central Park, mingling with neighbors like the Rockefellers. Yet even as a child, she found family life neither warm nor secure. Her father was notoriously unfaithful. Her mother stayed remote. Governesses administered discipline rather than nurture. Peggy described her childhood as excessively unhappy, a period in which she found no pleasant memories of any kind. If she ever laughed or smiled then, it was likely stifled under the house's tensions. Her father briefly introduced a sense of playful affection into Peggy's life, but that link was severed under appalling circumstances. In 1912, at age 12, Peggy was a precocious child who openly confronted him over his prolonged absences. He soon returned to Europe, hoping to keep up with his amusements and avoid the family's discontent. A few months later, her youngest sister Hazel begged him to come home for her birthday, to which he eventually agreed. He booked passage on the RMS Titanic crossing from Cherbourg. Famously, he died in the sinking of the Titanic, having helped women and children into lifeboats. The last time witnesses saw him, he wore his finest evening attire, embodying a grim sense of chivalry. His body was never recovered. Peggy never overcame the shock. Her mother, blaming Hazel for urging him to return, inflicted new guilt and bitterness on the family. Grief soon strangled the household, and Peggy's once absent father became a mythic figure in her mind, lost at sea, never to be retrieved. As Peggy became a teenager, she grew acutely self-conscious about her appearance. She came to resent her nose as shapeless and large. In her late teens, she underwent a rhinoplasty, a procedure then in its infancy, which left her disappointed. If anything, she felt more discomfort afterward. At the same time, money from her inheritance, $450,000 at age 21, a big figure for most people but meager relative to other Guggenheims, granted her independence. This partial ostracism from the wealthiest Guggenheims fueled her sense of being not a real Guggenheim anymore, as she once lamented. Nevertheless, the money gave her the freedom to leave the family's watchful eye and seek something beyond the gilded cage. She gravitated to Greenwich Village in New York, a Bohemian epicenter, and took a minor job in an avant-garde bookstore. There, she encountered figures like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Alfred Stieglitz, absorbing their rebellious perspectives on art, literature, and photography. Stieglitz introduced her to modernist painting, particularly the works of George O'Keeffe, And Peggy felt an epiphany regarding the radical new languages of color and form. By the early 1920s, Peggy, in her early 20s, felt restless in New York. She craved Europe's more audacious Bohemian circles, so she moved to Paris. She began mingling with avant-garde luminaries, sculptor Constantin Brancusi, art collector Leo Stein, poet and publisher Harold Loeb, or the influential writer and editor Ford Madox Ford. These gatherings introduced her to surrealists, Dadaists, Cubists. She frequented Montparnasse cafes and soirees where strong cocktails and fierce debates about painting or sculpture were routine. Her circle included the unpredictable Marcel Duchamp, who changed how Peggy approached the very concept of art. He insisted anything could be art if placed in the right frame of mind, an idea that resonated with her own desire to live unconventionally. In 1922, Peggy married Lawrence Vail, an artist, writer, and famed Bohemian called the King of Bohemia by some. Their first encounter soared on spontaneity. Over dinner, he tried to seduce her. She welcomed the attention. While she was more affluent, he exuded a chaotic magnetism that Peggy found irresistible. They married that same year. Their union bore 2 children, Sinbad and Pegeen. Yet almost immediately, cracks appeared. Vail's behavior turned abusive. He walked on her stomach in anger, smeared jam in her hair, threatened violence. Despite Peggy's craving for love, she refused to be a permanent punching bag. By the late 1920s, she discovered he was having an affair, and she swiftly ended the marriage. Vail took custody of Sinbad, while Peggy retained Pegeen. It echoed the coldness she had known in her own childhood, though she tried to be more attentive to her daughter than her mother had been to her. However, her intense thirst for romantic adventure often overshadowed consistent parenting. Divorced and still young, Peggy roamed the Bohemian enclaves of Paris, attracting new lovers with little hesitation. In 1928, she entangled herself with the British writer John Holmes, a tall, handsome figure whose intense passions enthralled her. Holmes, however, devolved into cruelty, forcing her into humiliating acts. He died after a freak riding accident followed by a botched surgery, leaving Peggy in a swirl of grief once more. She then drifted into a pattern of short-lived, intense affairs. Rumors claim that across her entire life she bedded thousands of men. Peggy neither confirmed nor seriously denied the speculation, joking in later interviews. Which do you mean, my husband's or other people's husbands? The swirl of these relationships sometimes overshadowed her intelligence. She was far from a passive ingenue, though. She read widely, devoured intellectual debates, and carried the restless mind of someone who wanted to shape culture, not merely revel in it. In 1933, Peggy tried living with English publisher Douglas Garman, a committed communist. Under Garman's urging, Peggy briefly joined the Communist Party in Great Britain. However, Garman soon left her for another woman, intensifying her sense that men used her or drifted away after a moment of passion. Distressed, Peggy's friends recommended she pursue something creative. They recognized her gift for spotting exciting new art forms and told her, why not open a gallery? She found the idea invigorating. Modern art had captured her imagination since her time in Stieglitz's orbit. She recognized a chance to preserve and champion that radical new wave of painting, sculpture, and design. By 1938, at age 40, Peggy opened a London gallery called Guggenheim Jeune. Its first exhibition showcased Jean Cocteau's drawings. Word spread that Peggy's space offered a raw, daring vantage point for modern art, distinct from Britain's more polite traditions. She soon staged pioneering exhibitions featuring Henry Moore, Pablo Picasso, even Kandinsky. Also around this time, she ignited a stormy affair with the Irish writer Samuel Beckett, who would later receive the Nobel Prize. Their romance was fervid, yet short-lived. 4-day seclusions in a Paris hotel, late-night arguments, the typical cycle of passion Peggy found. Beckett's impoverished status made their dynamic occasionally comedic. He used her money to fill his car's tank or buy whiskey. Eventually, like so many of her men, he drifted away, though they parted somewhat amicably. With war looming, Peggy returned to Paris in 1939, determined to expand her collection. She pledged to buy one art piece every day. She courted exasperated gallery owners and reluctant artists who disliked her direct manner. During one visit to Picasso's studio, the notoriously moody master scorned her, telling her, "Madame, the lingerie department is on the second floor," mocking her sense of style. It did not faze her. She steadily acquired paintings by Georges Braque, Fernand Léger, Max Ernst, Salvador Dalí, Joan Miró, Marc Chagall, and others. The approach was no mere whim. Peggy believed modern art captured the radical essence of her generation's worldview, and she was unafraid of experimental or degenerate works labeled as such by the Nazi regime. But as the Nazi threat closed in, she recognized the grave risk to her own safety. She was Jewish, after all, and the potential destruction of modern art by the Nazis. Museums like the Louvre refused to store her collection, deeming modern pieces unworthy of their space. So Peggy stashed them in a friend's barn in the Vichy countryside, hoping they'd be spared confiscation or burning. At age 45, Peggy fled Europe for New York in 1941, traveling with her ex-husband Lawrence Vail, his new soon-to-be ex-wife, her 2 children, and painter Max Ernst. She reestablished herself in Manhattan, refusing to let the trauma of war snuff out her commitment to modernism. She opened another gallery, and with Ernst's help, curated major shows of surrealists and abstractionists. The success was electric. The U.S. art scene, particularly in Manhattan, had become a haven for European exiles fleeing the war, so Peggy's gallery tapped into a swirl of new talent. She effectively helped shift the center of gravity for modern art from Paris to New York. Among the artists she championed was the then unknown Jackson Pollock, a carpenter at her uncle's Guggenheim Museum. Peggy recognized Pollock's raw, explosive potential. Though rumors swirled that Pollock found her physically unappealing, telling a friend he'd need to put a bag over her head, Peggy overlooked personal slight in favor of fostering his career, giving him stipends to paint full-time. Amid this dynamic environment, Peggy married Max Ernst around 1942. Their relationship was as unorthodox as any of her romances. Ernst occasionally cross-dressed in her clothes for comedic or rebellious effect. Peggy financed his projects and introduced him to fresh influences in American art. But the honeymoon was brief. In staging an all-woman show, 31 women, at her gallery, Peggy signaled her support for female artists, a radical stance at a time when mainstream galleries rarely featured women. This event inadvertently introduced Ernst to Dorothea Tanning, a fellow surrealist painter. Ernst fell in love with Tanning and left Peggy, continuing the heartbreak cycle that defined her personal life. After the war, Peggy yearned for Europe again, especially for Italy. She purchased an 18th-century Venetian palazzo, the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, sitting majestically along the Grand Canal. By 1949, she'd relocated there with her rescued collection. She turned the palazzo into a personal temple of modernism, cramming every room, even the bathrooms, with masterpieces from Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, Kurt Schwitters, René Magritte, Pierre Mondrian, Constantin Brancusi, Alexander Calder, and Marcel Duchamp. Freed from the rigid social codes of earlier decades, She roamed Venice's canals with up to 15 Lhasa Apsos, or other small dogs, which she adored. On afternoons when the Venetian lights shimmered on the water, she lounged on her rooftop, often sunbathing nude or nearly nude. She opened the palazzo to the public a few days each week. Locals and art pilgrims lined up to see her holdings, reminiscent of the semi-public nature of Renaissance palazzi turned into personal museums. Peggy's social calendar in Venice glowed with flamboyant gatherings, overshadowed only by her unquenchable desire for new experiences. She hosted parties that included luminaries like Tennessee Williams, who found the city's languid romance a perfect complement to his writing, and Truman Capote, who thrived on the gossip swirling around Peggy's comedic or scandalous flirtations with gondoliers or race car drivers. She remained drawn to men of working-class background, perhaps because they reflected a simpler sincerity missing from so many of her self-absorbed Bohemian lovers in Paris and New York. She occasionally invited these men to her rooftop, encouraging playful banter among her dogs and guests. Venice's labyrinthine charm underscored the comedic spectacle, European nobility, avant-garde artists, and Peggy's lively entourage, all swirling in an environment equal parts decadent and magical. Yet tragedy refused to release its grip on her. Her daughter Peggy grew into an accomplished painter, albeit overshadowed by her mother's flamboyance. Peggy struggled with depression and alcoholism, culminating in her suicide in 1967. Peggy was devastated, describing the loss as a permanent hole in her life. She turned one room of the palazzo into a quiet tribute, displaying only Peggy's paintings. This heartbreak, on top of earlier tragedies, weighed heavily. She immersed herself more in the daily operations of her Venetian museum, perhaps as a shield against despair. In her final decades, Peggy's flamboyant presence remained intact. She cruised the canal in what was rumored to be Venice's last private gondola, sporting large sunglasses, flamboyant hats, and occasionally a favorite dog perched by her side. She lunched in small trattorias near the Rialto, bantering with waiters in broken Italian. Her personal appearance, wild glasses, mismatched swirling prints, became iconic. As she aged, her hair turned an eccentric swirl of silver, offset by turquoise or fuchsia wraps. Younger Venetians found her both an institution and an enigma. She died of a stroke in December 1979 at age 81. In her will, she directed that her ashes be buried in the palazzo's garden near the graves of her beloved dogs. To Peggy, that private corner symbolized continuity between her personal life, her chosen family of canines, and her aesthetic legacy. It was a final gesture of melding life and art, illusions and authenticity, heartbreak and triumph. Following her death, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, founded by her uncle, eventually took stewardship of the palazzo. It became the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, one of the world's premier museums for modern art. Even in the years after, visitors sense her presence in the sun-dappled courtyard, the mosaic floors, the quiet corner where she rests. Each canvas or sculpture offers a testament to the restless spirit that hunted for artistic revelation, an unrelenting quest that overshadowed repeated heartbreak. In many ways, Peggy Guggenheim's life might have made a comedic tragedy if not for her unyielding devotion to modern art. She used her father's titanic inheritance, tainted with personal sorrow, and turned it into a catalyst for cultural progress, rescuing works from potential destruction and elevating unknown artists to future legends. She walked the tightrope between scandal and significance, forging a museum that stands as a testament to her personal taste in surrealism, cubism, abstraction, and all the radical movements once scorned by mainstream critics. She never apologized for her flamboyant love life or her unorthodox style, famously retorting, "I have always lived my life exactly as I wanted." The illusions that shaped her, wealth, heartbreak, rebelliousness, coalesced into one grand contribution. Even her obituary overshadowed many petty controversies, focusing on her final gift to the world, that extraordinary collection in Venice, a place where visitors can see Pollock's swirling lines, Brancusi's sleek forms, Picasso's fractured portraits, Calder's whimsical mobiles, all side by side. With each painting, one glimpses not only the radical transformations of 20th century art, but also the fearless woman who insisted these pieces deserved admiration, who traveled across countries at war to preserve them, who weathered personal tragedies and used them as impetus for forging new paths. Hers is a story of improbable resilience, a life underscored by heartbreak and by the unstoppable conviction that within chaos lies the possibility of meaning. Peggy Guggenheim inhabited a world shaped by tragedies that might have defeated a less determined soul. Instead, she rose again and again, defying expectations and forging a role as both muse and mother, seductress and scorned lover, collector and caretaker. She scandalized buttoned-up elites with her freewheeling romantic life, championed female artists long before anyone else found that fashionable, and sheltered the degenerate geniuses of Europe's avant-garde when they faced persecution. The swirl of comedic, romantic, and tragic energies that made up her existence never truly settled into a neat resolution, leaving behind an aura of restlessness, overshadowed by moments of grandeur and sorrow. She bedded countless lovers, married several times, endured calamities that claimed the lives of people she loved, and through it all, she clung fiercely to her unwavering belief that modern art was the future, that pushing boundaries, however scandalous, was the only route to authentic living. To approach her story is to enter a labyrinth of details both glamorous and heartbreaking. She was born into wealth. Her father, Benjamin Guggenheim, belonged to an industrial empire that modernized entire industries. Her mother, Florette Seligman, was a child of a prominent banking line. Peggy's early days, set against a backdrop of Manhattan mansions overlooking Central Park, seldom brought her joy. In a swirl of genealogical privilege, she faced coldness at home, distant parents, sadistic governesses, and older siblings who likewise felt neglected. The single figure who offered her genuine warmth was her father, who indulged her curiosity and teased her with playful remarks. Yet fate tore him away in 1912. He perished heroically when the RMS Titanic foundered in the North Atlantic, leaving Peggy with emotional scars she would never fully mend. Her youngest sister, Hazel, was cruelly blamed by their mother for insisting he return to the U.S. for her birthday, a twist that turned everyday sorrow into a lifelong burden of guilt for poor Hazel, and a more generalized family bitterness that cast shadows across Peggy's entire upbringing. In the aftermath of the Titanic tragedy, Peggy's childhood metamorphosed into a haunted period. She discovered no sense of safety within her mother's presence, no comfort in the so-called guardians who replaced her father's paternal love. Instead, she locked emotions away, channeling them into her blossoming fascination with art, literature, and rebellious conversation. By her teenage years, she felt stifled by the superficial demands of her wealthy social sphere. The early seeds of her defiance sprouted. She had a rhinoplasty to correct what she perceived as a bulbous nose. The technology was rudimentary, leaving her feeling scarcely more attractive, yet it stood as an emblem of her readiness to challenge her own insecurities with radical gestures. Meanwhile, she took to reading subversive books, dabbling in free discussions about sexuality, autonomy, and the right of women to chart their destinies. At 21, she inherited around $450,000, a fraction of the Guggenheim fortune, but enough to grant her autonomy from meddling relatives. No longer constrained, she could shift from stifling drawing rooms into the avant-garde circles that would shape her future. She gravitated toward Greenwich Village, stepping into Bohemian enclaves brimming with artists, writers, and political freethinkers. There, she met the likes of Alfred Stieglitz, the brilliant photographer and champion of modernism, who opened her eyes to the groundbreaking visions of Georgia O'Keeffe, Picasso, and others. No longer was she just a bored heiress. She felt an awakening, an acknowledgement that within her lay an appetite for radical expression. Yet the city itself often felt limiting too. The social codes of old money Manhattan might have tolerated her, but they never wholly accepted her. She yearned for Europe, where the aesthetic revolutions of Surrealism, Dada, and Cubism roiled the old order. In the early 1920s, she moved to Paris, immersing herself fully in its cafes, studios, and parties. She forged friendships with Marcel Duchamp, Constantin Brancusi, and sculptor Alexander Calder, among others, learning that art could be playful, irreverent, savage, and enlightening all at once. Alongside these revelations came her entanglements with men of various temperaments and talents, from moody bohemians to smug intellectuals. Some relationships ended in mutual acceptance, others in heartbreak. In 1922, she married Lawrence Vail, a charismatic figure known as the King of Bohemia, who was creative but also prone to outbursts of cruelty. They had 2 children, Sinbad and Peggy. As a mother, Peggy vacillated between intense devotion and swift impatience, echoing her own upbringing by a distant mother. Vail's behavior became physically and emotionally abusive. Once, the story goes, he walked on her stomach in a rage, humiliating her in the presence of others. Unable to endure, she divorced him in the late 1920s, yet another abrupt break that left her reeling. For a time, Peggy found fleeting respite in the arms of other men, among them John Holmes, an affair that swiftly turned sour when he subjected her to more humiliations. Then came a swirl of shorter flings, a pattern that persisted throughout her life. Some have characterized her approach to romance as impulsive, driven by a desire for unconditional attention she'd never received as a child, laced with the sense that heartbreak might be inevitable anyway. But amid these personal storms, she never allowed her fascination with art to wane. She haunted galleries, strolled through Montparnasse with intellectual cynics, visited sculptors' studios. While she never took formal training as an artist herself, her deepening knowledge shaped an acute curatorial sense that she would later channel into the management of her own galleries. In 1933, she tried to settle down with Douglas Garman, a British communist with unyielding ideological fervor. She briefly considered following him into the party, as she wrote in a letter, but found politics less appealing than art. When he left her for another comrade, Peggy found herself on shaky emotional ground. Yet again, friends proposed she open a gallery to quell her existential drift. So in 1938, she launched Guggenheim Jeune in London, determined to champion modernism. She famously inaugurated it with an exhibition of Jean Cocteau's work, causing minor scandals among London's more conservative critics. Over the next 2 years, she showcased Henry Moore, Wassily Kandinsky, and others. By then, she'd taken another passionate lover, the Irish writer Samuel Beckett, who was broke but intellectually electric. They spent days locked in a Paris hotel, ignoring the outside world. But he too departed abruptly. Peggy pressed on, vowing to buy one new piece of art every day if possible. The outbreak of World War II forced Peggy into frantic solutions. Fearing Nazi confiscation of the modern work she'd painstakingly acquired, persecuted as degenerate by the Reich, she attempted to store them or smuggle them to safety. The Louvre's curators refused them as worthless. She had to stow them in a friend's barn in the Vichy countryside, gambling they'd remain undiscovered. Meanwhile, aware that she was a Jewish Guggenheim, Peggy realized her own life was in danger. She fled Europe with an entourage that included her ex-husband, his soon-to-be ex-wife, her 2 children, and painter Max Ernst, an influential surrealist. In New York, she opened a new gallery, continuing her mission to elevate modern art in the city that was quickly becoming an artistic epicenter for refugees from war-torn Europe. At midlife, Peggy married Max Ernst. The relationship, typically for Peggy, was short-lived. Ernst fell for Dorothea Tanning, another surrealist. Peggy, however, kept forging ahead. She introduced the American public to ground-shattering artists, including a then-unknown Jackson Pollock. The rumor that Pollock disdained her romantically didn't matter. Peggy recognized his genius, underwriting him so he could paint full-time in a rural barn. That faith changed American art history, as Pollock soared to become the face of abstract expressionism. Undeterred by heartbreak, Peggy poured energy into a new show called 31 Women, possibly the first all-women art exhibition in the U.S. As a wealthy woman championing female artists, she faced sneers and cynicism. Critics called her misguided, moralistic, or naive. She answered them by mounting more exhibitions, building new networks of Bohemian voices. Eventually, Peggy felt America was no longer the frontier of her heart's desire. She wanted the dreamlike old-world atmosphere of Italy, so she purchased the 18th century Palazzo Venier dei Leoni on Venice's Grand Canal. There, from 1949 onward, she spent her life making that building not just a home, but a public museum of her mind. She lined every corridor, every bathroom, with paintings and sculptures from the likes of Picasso, Duchamp, Brancusi, Miro, and Mondrian. Owning more than 200 major works, she refused to let them gather dust in private storerooms. 3 afternoons a week, she opened her house to the public, letting visitors meander among her dogs, sometimes up to 15, yapping around the living room, while she might lie sunbathing on the rooftop or wander in, wearing flamboyant dresses. People spoke of the Venice Palazzo as an extension of Peggy's persona, chaos and brilliance in equal measure. Her personal life in Venice was a swirl of parties, regattas, bohemian affairs, and comedic mishaps. She might invite a racing driver to a masked ball or attend an elegant dinner wearing an outlandishly modern outfit, overshadowing the staid aristocrats. She became an unmistakable presence on the canals, at times floating in a private gondola that was rumored to be Venice's last privately owned one. Posing on the prow, sporting large tinted glasses and an elaborate hat, she embodied an eccentric spirit that could still shock staid Venetian society. Meanwhile, her passion for collecting never ended. She considered new acquisitions, swapped or sold duplicates, donated minor pieces to museums, and spurred the careers of more emerging talents. However, heartbreak remained her companion. In 1967, her daughter Peggy, now a depressed alcoholic painter, died by suicide. News reached Peggy via a terse telegram. The tragedy nearly shattered her. She admitted she had never felt so bereft, describing Peggy as both a child and a dear friend. In her memory, Peggy turned one room of the palazzo into a permanent display of Peggy's works, a quiet testament to maternal grief overshadowed by relentless devotion to creativity. From that moment on, Peggy's outward flamboyance took on a somber edge. She continued to appear at parties, some with Yoko Ono, Truman Capote, or Tennessee Williams. But an undercurrent of sorrow coursed through her presence. The swirl of comedic and tragic notes in Peggy's life stands out starkly. She was at once comedic, be it in the flamboyant way she teased critics, her devil-may-care romantic entanglements, or the chaotic menageries of dogs, and tragically haunted, the father who drowned in the Titanic, the repeated heartbreak, the parted lovers, the suicides and accidents that claimed siblings, nephews, and a daughter. Yet she never relented in championing modern art. She believed wholeheartedly that art was the purest form of rebellion and the clearest path to personal liberation. She financed artists, curated exhibitions, funded expeditions for them to explore new mediums. She especially admired bold female creators like Leonora Carrington, Leonore Feeney, and Dorothea Tanning, at a time when few established galleries took them seriously. Her love affairs, comedic or tragic, never fully overshadowed her serious, unstoppable commitment to pushing the boundaries of aesthetic experience. In the 1970s, Peggy could be found drifting around Venice, wearing flamboyant dresses or wide-brimmed hats, accompanied by a cloud of small, high-energy dogs. She recognized that the city changed around her, more tourists, more commercial hustle, but she sought to maintain her palazzo as a place of timeless calm and radical expression. She gradually opened up more tours, confiding to journalists that she wished for the place to remain a museum after her death so that her beloved artworks would never be scattered to private bidders. When she passed away in December 1979, aged 81, from a stroke, she had long arranged for her ashes to rest in a corner of the palazzo's garden next to the tombstones of her dogs. This final choice expressed her comedic sense of equality between all creatures, herself, her faithful animals, and by extension the cosmic swirl of creation she found in art. In the years since, the Peggy Guggenheim collection has turned into one of the most visited art sites in Venice. Tourists file through the garden, glimpsing the simple plaque marking her name. The museum's docents recount bits of her life story, how she once wore outrageous hats that overshadowed even the local aristocracy, how she might greet visitors while wearing a bathrobe, how she championed a young Pollock, or how she insisted she had enough lovers to fill a library of diaries. The comedic swirl and tragic gloom unify in an abiding sense of her presence. It's said that if you stroll the Grand Canal late at night, you can imagine her silhouette perched on a balcony, a Lhasa Apso in her lap, pondering the day's comedic intrigues and the centuries of art history behind her. Yet ironically, for all the heartbreak, comedic fiascos, and ephemeral romances, Peggy Guggenheim left behind an unambiguous legacy that overshadowed personal failings. The redefinition of art, collecting as an act of cultural service rather than private vanity. She recognized that works by uncelebrated or scorned geniuses needed stewardship to survive. She risked money, energy, and at times her safety to preserve these pieces from war, prejudice, or mere indifference. She curated them not as an elitist might, but more as a rebellious caretaker, hosting them in a home open to any curious mind, bridging the comedic hush of Venetian afternoons with the radical hush of an abstract painting. Hers was a bold social statement that a single determined woman, once overshadowed by fatherly tragedies, overshadowed by heartbreaks, overshadowed by ephemeral gossip, could harness wealth in ways that shaped the future's appreciation for imagination. Today, for those who wander Venice's canals, The Peggy Guggenheim collection stands perched along the Grand Canal, a single-story facade concealing an enchanting garden and rooms filled with the milestones of radical 20th century creativity. Visitors arrive expecting a typical museum, but they find a grand home preserving the intimate arrangement Peggy once lived with. A large sign pays homage to the dogs buried with her in the garden, each name inscribed as if an old friend. The same air of rebelliousness lingers in the architecture, reflecting Peggy's refusal to be pinned down by societal norms. Her life, with all its scandal, romance, comedic fiascos, and heartbreak, resonates through the corridors. Each painting also murmurs stories about how she acquired it, some in hurried deals before Nazi invasion, some in abrupt negotiations with a drunk Picasso or a lofty Miro, some saved from condemnation as degenerate. In the end, Peggy Guggenheim's life never conformed to neat Hollywood endings. Born into a glittering world that swiftly revealed its cruelty, bruised by personal tragedies from a father on the Titanic to the suicide of her daughter, she continuously used adversity as fuel for radical leaps. She turned heartbreak into impetus for new journeys, paramours into impetus for knowledge, and illusions of wealth into impetus for cultural legacy. Whether comedic or tragic, her saga epitomizes the intense human desire to craft beauty from sorrow, forging private heartbreak into public creativity. That, more than any fleeting scandal, stands as her ultimate gift. In a sense, she lived at the crossroad of catastrophe and creation, losing her father to the Titanic, losing fortunes at times, being used or dismissed by men, yet each crisis yielded a new dimension of her personal or artistic scope. So perhaps the best way to interpret Peggy is not as a collection of sensational anecdotes, though sensational they certainly were, but as a figure who believed unwaveringly in the emancipatory power of art. Through countless heartbreaks and comedic fiascos, she insisted on championing radical movements. Ultimately, she taught the art world to look beyond the safe, accepted norms, to celebrate the dreamers who break old rules. In so doing, she also wrote her own name across history, ensuring that nobody could forget the flamboyant woman who collected not just masterpieces, but a ring of notorious lovers, who hosted outlandish soirees in Venice, who fended off mockery and tragedy with the same defiant grin, who weathered heartbreak, yet still found it in herself to smile at a new painting or a newly arrived dog. With each passing decade, new generations discover her Venetian palazzo, linger in that luminous garden, and sense the echoes of her unstoppable spirit. The quiet corner that holds her ashes can still be visited by those who know where to look. Sometimes a tourist is overheard asking, who exactly was Peggy Guggenheim? The docents, or sometimes the plaque, will recount the basics: American heiress, art patron, friend to major artists. But behind that official summary stands a saga far deeper, shaped by heartbreak, illusions, comedic quirks, and undeniable vision. Even now, we do not have a final closure on the complexities that drove her. Instead, we possess the legacy she left, a cross-continental curation that irreversibly changed how we see modern art, plus a biography that bristles with theatrical intensity, overshadowing easy definitions. Peggy Guggenheim left us in December 1979, succumbing to a stroke. She once said she wanted to remain in her beloved Venice forever, and indeed she does, interred near her dogs, enveloped by the city's watery hush and the art she championed. If ghosts exist, one imagines her occasionally drifting through the rooms of the palazzo, peering at the Picasso or Calder or Pollock, lightly rearranging them in her mind, maybe recollecting old paramours or flamboyant dinner gatherings. In that haunting sense, Peggy Guggenheim's illusions never died. They envelop her Venetian palace, swirling in the shared stories told by docents, the diaries left behind, the flamboyant pictures of her perched on the roof with a menagerie of Lhasa Apsos. The heartbreak that studded her existence seems to dissolve in the glint of the Grand Canal's waters, replaced by the comedic final sparkle that an unrepentant life well lived can offer. Thus, the name Peggy Guggenheim endures not merely as a wealthy recluse or a scandal-laden siren, but as a key revolutionary force in the acceptance and celebration of modern art. She shouldered personal tragedies and overcame them by fostering new forms of aesthetic expression, proving that heartbreak can be reshaped into a cultural inheritance for the world. We might remember the scandalous lovers or outlandish soirees. We might recall the comedic fiascos involving her father's Titanic fate or her dog-choked gondola rides. But ultimately, Peggy Guggenheim stands as an icon of how devotion, an unyielding devotion to both personal liberty and radical creativity, can carve out a new chapter in history. In the final analysis, that unwavering alliance with the art she adored outshone every heartbreak, giving her the comedic last laugh in a world that tried, time and again, to reduce her to a trivial side note. Instead, she remains a star shining over the Grand Canal, whispering through every canvas. Illusions can fade, but the passion that fueled them endures.